the provisions of the EDCA and our own national interest. And I think at this stage, our main foreign policy is really to be friends to all.
Something has changed in the Philippines, and this time, Washington is not talking about another military exercise, another diplomatic meeting, or another statement about the importance of the Indo-Pacific. This time, the message is about something much more tangible: infrastructure. On August 13, a senior American defense official confirmed that the United States has made substantial progress at the military facilities covered by the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement, better known as EDCA.
As we all know, the EDCA not focuses on boosting the EAP capability, but also on the Department of National Defense various effort to level up the country's defense capabilities, that is, both the civil and military defense aspect of our country.
Elbridge Colby, the U.S. Undersecretary of War for Policy, said Washington has made significant progress over the past 18 months and expects even more in the future. He also described the Philippines as a model ally.
A resolute and proud nation in the Philippines that is determined to strengthen its own capabilities to better defend itself and its interests, a model ally.
At first glance, this might sound like another routine update in the long-running U.S.-Philippines defense relationship. It is not. Because there is a major difference between having access to a military facility and having a military facility that is actually capable of supporting operations. And that distinction may be the most important part of this entire story. For years, EDCA existed primarily as a framework. It gave Washington and Manila a legal and political mechanism for expanding defense cooperation, conducting joint training, constructing agreed facilities, and pre-positioning equipment and supplies at designated Philippine military locations. But a framework is only as useful as what is built around it. Now, Washington is saying that the physical side of this arrangement is moving forward. That raises a much bigger question. What exactly is the United States trying to build in the Philippines? And perhaps even more importantly, why does the geography of these facilities matter so much to China? Because when you put the 9 EDCA locations on a map, the story becomes much bigger than the Philippines. It becomes a story about Taiwan. It becomes a story about the South China Sea. It becomes a story about the Luzon Strait. And ultimately, it becomes a story about how the United States is trying to reshape its military posture across the Western Pacific without relying on a handful of enormous permanent bases. The United States and the Philippines are not simply strengthening an alliance on paper. They are gradually giving that alliance physical depth. And that could change the strategic equation across the Indo-Pacific. Let's start with what we know. During a virtual press briefing on August 13, Elbridge Colby said that the United States had substantially accelerated its relationship with the Philippines and that progress had been made at the EDCA sites. He also said Washington anticipated more progress. That language matters. Because Colby did not present EDCA as a completed project. He presented it as something still developing. He also declined to provide additional details for security reasons. That is important because it tells us something about the nature of the announcement. Washington is confirming movement without revealing everything that is happening on the ground. In other words, the public is being told that the infrastructure is progressing, but not necessarily exactly what every facility is now capable of doing. That leaves room for analysis. And the analysis begins with a simple question. What is EDCA actually designed to accomplish? The Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement was signed in 2014. It created a framework for greater defense cooperation between the United States and the Philippines, including joint training, access to agreed Philippine military locations, construction of facilities, and the pre-positioning of equipment and supplies. Current reporting confirms that the arrangement does not establish permanent American basing in the Philippines. That distinction is important. This is not the return of the old American military bases in the Philippines. Instead, the emerging model is much more flexible. American forces can operate alongside Philippine forces. Facilities can be developed. Equipment can be positioned. Exercises can be conducted. Logistics can be improved. And military forces can potentially move through the country more efficiently when required. That may sound less dramatic than the construction of a giant American base. Strategically, however, it can be extremely significant. Because modern military power is not only about ships, aircraft, missiles, and soldiers. It is also about distance. It is about logistics. It is about how quickly those forces can move. And it is about whether the infrastructure exists to support them once they arrive. That is where EDCA becomes interesting. Think about military power for a moment. A fighter aircraft is powerful. A naval vessel is powerful. A missile system is powerful. But none of them operate in isolation. Aircraft need runways, maintenance, fuel, communications, and support personnel. Ships need ports, supplies, maintenance, and logistics. Ground forces need ammunition, fuel, transportation, communications, and medical support. And all of that requires infrastructure. This is why the latest EDCA announcement deserves more attention than the phrase progress at military sites might initially suggest. The real transformation is from access to usable access. The first phase of an alliance can be diplomatic. The second can be political. The third can be military. But the fourth is physical, and once infrastructure is built, it remains. An exercise ends. A diplomatic meeting ends. A political statement eventually disappears from the news cycle. But a runway remains. A storage facility remains. A communications network remains. A logistics hub remains. That is why infrastructure can have a strategic lifespan much longer than the event that created it. The basic logic is simple. Infrastructure supports logistics. Logistics supports readiness. Readiness supports deterrence. And deterrence is ultimately what Washington says it wants to strengthen in the region. This is why the latest announcement from Colby is significant. The question is no longer simply whether the United States has access to Philippine military facilities. The question is how capable those facilities are becoming. Today, the Philippines has 9 EDCA sites. They are spread across the country rather than concentrated in a single area. There is Basa Air Base in Pampanga, Fort Magsaysay in Nueva Ecija, Lumbia in Cagayan de Oro, Antonio Bautista Air Base in Palawan, Mactan Benito Ebuen Air Base in Cebu, Naval Base Camilo Ocias in Cagayan, Lalo Airport in Cagayan, Camp Melchor de la Cruz in Isabela, and Balabac Island in Palawan. But simply reading those names misses the real story. The important thing is not any one individual location. It is the network they create. Look north. The Cagayan and Isabela facilities are part of the EDCA network in northern Luzon. And northern Luzon is strategically important because of its proximity to Taiwan and the Luzon Strait. Now look south and west. Palawan and Balabac connect the network to the Philippines' western approaches and the wider South China Sea. Then look towards central Philippines. Facilities in Pampanga, Nueva Ecija, Cebu, and Cagayan de Oro provide additional geographic depth across the archipelago. This matters because the Philippines is not one compact landmass. It is an archipelago, and that geography creates both challenges and opportunities for military planners. A distributed network can potentially make it more difficult for an adversary to neutralize an entire military posture with a single strike. Instead of concentrating everything in one giant base, capabilities can be spread across multiple locations. That is the logic behind distributed military infrastructure, and it is becoming increasingly important in the Indo-Pacific. Now put the Philippines on a map. To the north is Taiwan. Between northern Luzon and Taiwan is the Luzon Strait. To the west is the South China Sea. Further north and west is mainland China. And beyond the Philippines lies the wider Western Pacific. Suddenly, EDCA looks very different. The Philippines occupies an unusually important geographic position. It sits along the broader First Island chain and close to several strategic maritime routes. For Washington, that geography creates options. For Manila, it provides leverage and potentially stronger defensive capabilities. For Beijing, however, the same geography can create a serious strategic concern. Because the issue is not simply whether American soldiers are physically present at one particular location. The issue is whether the United States and its allies are gradually creating a distributed military network around China's maritime periphery. That is a very different question. And it is why Beijing watches developments in the Philippines so closely. There is a temptation to describe EDCA in the simplest possible terms. America is building bases in the Philippines. But that description is incomplete, and in some respects, it can be misleading. The arrangement is designed around defense cooperation, training, access, infrastructure, and pre-positioning rather than the restoration of the permanent American bases that existed in the Philippines during the Cold War. The distinction matters because the strategic model Washington is pursuing today is different from the model of decades ago. The United States does not necessarily need enormous permanent installations everywhere. Instead, it can work with allies and partners to develop infrastructure that allows American and allied forces to operate more effectively when necessary. That creates flexibility. It also distributes risk. And it can make the regional military posture less dependent on any single location. Think of it this way. A military alliance is like a transportation network. The roads matter, the bridges matter, the ports matter, the airports matter, the warehouses matter, the communication systems matter. You can have the world's best military forces, but if they cannot move efficiently through the region, their effectiveness is reduced. This is why infrastructure is often the least glamorous part of military strategy, and one of the most important. There is another part of this story that cannot be ignored. The Philippines is becoming increasingly important to American regional strategy because Manila itself is becoming more willing to deepen defense cooperation with Washington. Colby explicitly praised the Philippines as a model ally and said Washington sees further progress ahead following discussions with President Ferdinand Marcos Jr. and Defense Secretary Gilberto Teodoro Jr. That phrase, model ally, deserves attention. It does not simply mean that Manila is friendly toward Washington. In strategic terms, an ally becomes valuable when it can contribute to a wider security architecture. The Philippines provides territory. It provides military facilities. It participates in exercises. It is modernizing its armed forces. It is strengthening external defense capabilities. And it sits in an exceptionally important geographic position. That combination makes Manila increasingly valuable to Washington. But there is another side to this. The Philippines is not simply doing all of this for the United States. Manila has its own interests. The Philippines has its own territorial disputes. It has its own concerns about maritime security. And it has its own interest in strengthening its ability to defend its sovereignty. This is why it would be a mistake to describe EDCA simply as an American project. It is a bilateral arrangement. Washington has strategic objectives. Manila has strategic objectives. And where those objectives overlap, cooperation becomes possible. Now we come to the part of the story that directly affects China's strategic calculations. The Philippines is one of the major claimants in the South China Sea. Tensions between Manila and Beijing have repeatedly centered on maritime encounters, disputed features, and competing claims. That means any increase in Philippine military capability can have consequences beyond Philippine territory. And any increase in American access can also affect the regional balance. This is where the EDCA network becomes particularly interesting. The Palawan and Balabac locations are positioned toward the country's western maritime approaches. Northern Luzon, meanwhile, faces the opposite strategic direction. Put these locations together and you begin to see something larger. The network gives the United States and the Philippines access to multiple strategic directions. That does not automatically mean that these sites are designed for war with China. It does mean that they can potentially provide additional options during a crisis. And in military strategy, options matter. A country that has more options can respond more flexibly. A country with fewer options can be easier to constrain. This is one reason infrastructure can influence deterrence even when it is never actually used in combat. The mere existence of additional capabilities can change calculations. And then there is Taiwan. This is where the EDCA story becomes even more sensitive. The Philippines is geographically close to Taiwan, particularly in the northern part of the country. Northern Luzon and the Cagayan region are separated from Taiwan by the Luzon Strait. That geography has enormous strategic importance. But we need to be careful here. It would be wrong to say that the EDCA facilities prove the United States is preparing to fight a war with China over Taiwan. The available evidence does not establish such a predetermined war plan. What EDCA does is increase strategic options. That distinction is crucial. In the event of a Taiwan crisis, geography could make the Philippines relevant to American military planning. But relevance does not equal inevitability. And access does not automatically equal participation in a conflict. The Philippines has its own political leadership. It has its own constitutional framework. It has its own national interests. And Manila would ultimately have to make decisions based on its own calculations. So the better way to understand EDCA is not as proof that a Taiwan war is coming. It is as an arrangement that gives Washington and Manila more choices in a region where geography is becoming increasingly important. This may be the most important point in the entire story. For years, analysts have focused heavily on military exercises. And exercises matter. They allow forces to train together. They improve interoperability. They expose weaknesses. They build familiarity. But exercises are temporary. Infrastructure is permanent. That changes the equation. Imagine an American and Philippine military exercise taking place at a particular facility. For several weeks, aircraft arrived. Troops train. Ships move. Communications networks operate. Then the exercise ends. The forces leave, but the infrastructure stays. The runway remains. The storage facility remains. The communications equipment remains. The roads remain. The logistics arrangements remain. And the next exercise can begin from a stronger starting point. This is why the development of EDCA facilities could be more consequential over time than any individual military exercise. The alliance is building institutional memory. It is building physical capacity. And it is building interoperability. That is how an alliance moves from political commitment toward operational capability. For much of the post-Cold War period, people often understood alliances through treaties and diplomatic relationships. You sign an agreement. You conduct exercises. You hold meetings. You issue joint statements. But modern military competition is increasingly about something more concrete. Where can forces operate? Where can supplies be stored? How quickly can aircraft move? Where can maintenance happen? How resilient are communications? How quickly can reinforcements arrive? And can allied militaries operate together without wasting critical time? These questions explain why EDCA matters. The alliance is becoming more than a treaty relationship. It is increasingly becoming a physical network. The formula is straightforward. Agreement creates access. Access creates the need for infrastructure. Infrastructure creates logistics. Logistics creates readiness. Readiness creates deterrence. And deterrence changes the strategic calculations of potential adversaries. That is the transformation taking place. There is one important reason not to exaggerate what is happening. Progress does not mean completion. And today's announcement does not mean every EDCA facility is suddenly fully operational or equally capable. In fact, the history of EDCA development has included delays, political debates, and questions about how quickly infrastructure has actually been constructed. That makes Colby's latest statement more interesting, not less, because Washington is now publicly emphasizing that progress has accelerated, and it is explicitly saying that more progress is expected. That suggests the next phase may involve a greater emphasis on implementation. The question is no longer whether EDCA exists. Everyone knows that it exists. The question is whether the infrastructure associated with it can become sufficiently developed to support the strategic objectives being discussed in Washington and Manila. That is something worth watching very closely. Now imagine this from Beijing's perspective. China does not see 9 isolated facilities. It sees a network. It sees increased American access. It sees stronger Philippine military capabilities. It sees deeper military interoperability. It sees additional logistics infrastructure. It sees northern Luzon sitting relatively close to Taiwan. It sees Palawan and Balabac facing the South China Sea, and it sees Washington strengthening relationships with other partners across the Indo-Pacific. From this perspective, EDCA is not merely a Philippine-American bilateral agreement. It is one component of a larger strategic architecture. And that is where the competition becomes complicated. Washington says stronger alliances can prevent conflict. Beijing can argue that increasing American military presence near China increases pressure and instability. Both arguments can exist simultaneously. And that is the paradox of deterrence. The same military capability that makes one side feel safer can make the other side feel more threatened. The United States may believe that stronger infrastructure makes aggression less attractive. China may believe that stronger American access makes military encirclement more serious. And the Philippines sits directly in the middle of this competition. This is ultimately the central question. Does EDCA make war less likely? Or could it make a future crisis more dangerous? The answer may be both. From Washington's perspective, stronger military infrastructure can strengthen deterrence. If an adversary knows that American and Philippine forces can move more quickly, communicate more effectively, and sustain operations more efficiently, the cost of aggression could become higher. That could discourage conflict. But from Beijing's perspective, the same infrastructure could be interpreted as an expansion of American military pressure. And that could produce countermeasures. More Chinese military activity, more deployments, more surveillance, more exercises, more pressure on Philippine forces. That can create a security dilemma. One side builds because it feels threatened. The other side sees that buildup and becomes more threatened. Then it builds further. And the cycle continues. This is why the EDCA story is not simply about who is right or wrong. It is about how military capabilities interact with perceptions. The most important thing now is to watch what happens after the announcement. Colby has already said that Washington expects further progress. That means EDCA should be viewed as an ongoing process rather than a finished project. More infrastructure could follow. More pre-positioning could become possible. More complex military exercises could use the facilities. Philippine forces could continue improving their ability to operate alongside American forces, and Washington could continue encouraging Manila to take on a greater role in regional deterrence. At the same time, Japan and Australia remain important to the broader security architecture developing around the Philippines. That matters because the future Indo-Pacific security system is unlikely to be built around one country acting alone. Instead, it is increasingly about networks. American military power, Philippine territory, Japanese capabilities, Australian cooperation, regional partnerships, interoperability, distributed logistics, and shared exercises. The result is something very different from the old alliance system. It is more distributed, more flexible, and potentially more resilient. So where does this leave us? The August 13 announcement is important because it tells us that EDCA is moving. But the real story is bigger than EDCA itself. In 2014, the agreement created the framework. Then came the identification of the initial facilities. In 2023, 4 additional locations expanded the network to 9. And now, in 2026, Washington is publicly saying that substantial progress has been made and that more is coming. That is an evolution. The United States is not simply gaining access to Philippine military facilities. It is gradually making that access more useful. And that distinction changes everything. Because military power is not only about possessing weapons. It is about having the infrastructure to move, sustain, and coordinate those weapons and the forces that operate them. That is what makes the Philippines increasingly important. Its geography gives it strategic value. Its alliance with Washington gives that geography military relevance. And the development of EDCA facilities gives the alliance greater physical depth. But there is a final point that should not be forgotten. None of this guarantees deterrence. None of this guarantees peace. And none of this guarantees that a future crisis involving Taiwan or the South China Sea will unfold in a particular way. What it does guarantee is that the United States and the Philippines are creating more options. And in great power competition, options are power. The question is therefore no longer whether the United States has access to the Philippines. It does. The more important question is how capable this alliance network becomes. How much infrastructure will actually be developed? How deeply will American and Philippine forces integrate? How will Japan and Australia fit into the wider architecture? And most importantly, how will China respond? Because the next chapter of the Indo-Pacific competition may not be defined by one dramatic military base or one spectacular weapons system. It may be defined by something much quieter. Runways, ports, warehouses, communications, logistics, exercises, and the ability to move forces across a region before a crisis becomes a war. That is what makes the latest EDCA announcement so important. The buildings themselves may not make headlines forever. Strategic balance of the Indo-Pacific for years to come.